This is the Extra Point Podcast. During this podcast, we will dive deeper into our Sunday teaching and share practical next steps for your faith journey. Now, let's kick off the Extra Point.
Hey everybody, I'm Will Ford. I'm an intern here at Southridge, and I'm sitting here with Pastor Cheryl, and we are going to go and dive deeper into Sunday's teaching. Now, Cheryl, could you give us a little bit of an overview of Sunday's teaching?
Sure. So we are in our Rise and Fall series, week 18, I believe. And so we are in 1 Samuel chapter 22, and I talked about whenever we are faced in a certain situation or place where it feels like we've maybe been traveling the opposite direction or a direction that we don't necessarily like or that we didn't want to go in, we tend to seek solutions. Yeah. And where we go to for those solutions matters. And so really we see David, kind of a difference between David and Saul. I didn't get into Saul a whole lot, mainly focus on David, but David, we see he went to God for his solution. And so I talked about how we need to really just trust the King, the true King, with whatever it is we're facing, or our struggles, our dreams, our desires, our goals. Trust those things to God. And in those moments where maybe we're not sure what to do, just wait on him until we do know. And there's a lot of difficulty in waiting. Mm-hmm. But it's one of those things when you can actually fully just know that he can bring you out of it, bring you through it, and trust him with anything in the process, then you'll end up finding that he's still moving and working even when you don't feel like he is.
Yeah, and that's some tough stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes a lot of patience to really get there. And I know I'm not the best at it, but I will sit there and try really hard at it. But in your point of view, though, what are some small steps we can take to grow that patience?
Yeah. So I think one of those things is really just focusing on what you do know that you can do during that time. Because a lot of times we can get so focused and almost obsessive about the things we don't know. Like, we don't know which direction to take. We don't know what job he's going to open up for us. We don't know these things. We can get so obsessive about that we're forgetting about the other things that we can do, that we do know, and that we do know we should do, that, we can lose sight of things, and we can often fail to get in his presence, either through prayer or the word, spending time in silence, and those kind of things. And so just making sure that you are focusing less on those things you don't know, more on what you do know, and trusting God with what you don't know during that time. But I would say even like dig in a little bit more in those disciplines, like just be more disciplined in those basic things we know that we're supposed to do. There's a reason why God says to do those things. Because they're usually the things that end up leading to us learning and knowing the other stuff that we don't know.
Yes,
it's what usually teaches us those things, and how God can use those moments to speak to us and share with us, to guide us, to help us in those moments. And so really just pray, get in the word. If you're not doing any of that, start small. Like, don't try to start with like a huge chunk of time, because you're probably going to fail at it. Like, so a small step, what I tend to tell people, like if they're not in the word at all, is to download the YouVersion Bible app and set it to where it notifies you about the verse of the day, and doing that verse of the day devotion that they do every day. Like, starting there, starting small. Maybe you don't even have the 2 minutes to watch the little video. At least read the scripture that they give you. There are widgets on most smartphones that go along with it, that it'll allow you to have a widget on your home screen that will show the verse of the day. And so when you unlock your phone in the morning, that's the first thing that you actually see.
Yeah.
Instead of going into other apps or other things, like that's something that's right there on your home screen that you can see. So starting really small is okay to do. If you are doing it, but you're sporadic with it, just actually being more intentional with saying, okay, this is the time of day that works best, where I'm less likely to be interrupted, or where, I know that I can actually focus on this, whether that's morning, evening, lunchtime, whatever. Actually putting that in there and saying, this is the time I do it. Like, put it in your calendar, just like you would an appointment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And making sure that you're being a little bit more disciplined.
Giving it more importance,
Yes, because we put importance like on things when we put it in our calendar. Like,
Yep.
I put those appointments in my calendar. I make sure that I don't miss them. I put even reminders like that, where it'll remind me so much time ahead of time, so that way I can prepare for it. I can leave on time. I can, do all those things. And so even just stuff like that are little small things that you can do that's going to end up helping you overall in the long run. I would also say, like, if you're really good at that, incorporating silence, if you haven't done that. I spoke about that a little bit on Sunday.
I've been trying that, and it's tough.
It is really tough. So we did this with staff. There is a guy named Pete Scazzaro, however you say it, that does emotionally healthy discipleship, emotionally healthy spirituality, all of that. And he has this day-by-day, daily office stuff that he goes through. And if you just look up the daily office, Pete Scazzaro, you should be able to find a YouTube video where he explains this a little bit better. And he talks about how you can do it, but also like within the daily habit devotional book, or daily office devotional book, he talks about coming up with a phrase that you can do at the beginning of the silence time and then throughout, for when your brain starts wandering, as it often does, to just kind of reorient yourself. And I think part of the patience thing, is giving yourself some grace over time to get better at it, because it starts out as a discipline. Like, disciplines aren't fun. It's not fun to be disciplined, and it's not always fun to be like to do disciplines. Like, but once you get to the point where you've done it for long enough, it actually becomes a desire.
Yeah.
Because when you don't do it, you miss it. And so giving yourself some grace as you go along to help build that desire and not just a discipline will help you grow as well.
Definitely. That's good stuff. I find that having that, I don't want to say mantra, but that saying to come back to, like, I'm here, Lord. It helps steady the mind to open it up to where you can really hear from God. And hearing from God is so important, because so often we'll find that we're just often talking at Him. And we've all been in those conversations, and they're very one-sided, and our relationship with God is not one-sided in the slightest. So we need to make room for God to be able to come in and speak. But that might be one way, but how can we know God's purpose for us, or believe that He has a purpose for us? Is it through those practices and, kind of, I don't know, really discerning what is the plan for us and what is God's plan for us? How can we go about having a good look at what that is?
Yeah. I think there are a few different ways. I think one of the things to really think about within this is that God's purpose and plan for your life, okay, the first most important thing is to be an image bearer of Him, right?
Yes.
Is to present His image back to the rest of created order. And we do this in the way that we interact with the created order, okay? So that's really the main thing. But as far as if you're talking what you're supposed to do with your life, like a job, a career, that type of level, think about the things that you're passionate about.
Yeah.
Think about the things that maybe break your heart, like that really move you in some way. Like, extreme emotions often get a bad rap, but sometimes, like, there are certain things that happen in the world that you react extremely to. And that might be something that actually is is a thing to trigger you, to help you realize that that might be something you need to get involved in your life. And it may be something on top of a career. Like, there are a lot of people that do a lot of good work outside of their careers. But remembering that, like, the way that God created you to interact with things and to feel about certain things is also part of his purpose and plan. Like, so if you're reacting strongly to something, or you feel really passionate about a certain topic or situation or social injustice or like whatever, then it's probably because he wants you to do something about that, to be involved
definitely.
in some way with that. I also don't believe that God will have you do something that goes totally against your nature. Like, and so, like, being self-aware and knowing who you are as a person somewhat, and like what you enjoy doing, like, now, there are things where he'll take you outside of your comfort zone a bit. He'll grow you and stretch you. So I think it's, it takes some time and some level of maturing to kind of know that balance of things.
Definitely
like,
a lot of introspection, right?
Yes. Like I shared a few weeks ago about how I had said I never wanted to teach adults.
Yeah.
Early on. Well, that was just my insecurities or my own fears talking. Like, that wasn't really me. Thankfully, God knows me better than I know myself. But spiritual gifts are huge within that as well. Like, knowing your spiritual gifts, knowing those things about who you are as an individual are huge to know. I will say that everybody has a purpose. God has a plan for everyone. Like, you were put on this earth for a reason. And I think often the trouble is that we usually will like to think that somebody else will come and do it if we don't do it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge excuse that might not actually be true. Because somebody may come along, God can use anyone, okay? God can use anyone to do anything. However, it may not happen as soon as it could have. Like, it may not happen in the same way. Like,
Yeah.
I would believe that there are probably a lot of people, and I read this or heard this somewhere, about how there are graveyards filled with visions and dreams, cures to cancer, like, who knows what, because they didn't act on things that they knew they should do.
Yeah.
And it hit me really hard because I was like, I think that we use that as an excuse too often, to where we just sit back and we don't actually move to try to make any changes, because sometimes what we feel really passionate about seems really big and we don't think we can do it on our own. But that's the point. We can't do it on our own. We're not supposed to do it on our own. Like, we're supposed to invite other people in. You do the things that you can do, but, like, meet other people along the way. Like, we talked as staff not long ago. We did this little thing where we were talking about how great leaders, I think it was like, they are they're able to, like, identify talent or that type of stuff, like, or people of extreme talent are attracted to them or that kind of thing. It's like, even within that, when you're passionate about something, a lot of times you end up meeting people and somehow or another it comes up and you find out they're passionate about the same thing. That's a big cue to say, oh, I need to remember this and keep them in mind, so that way maybe we can do something together, or we can talk about this a little bit more and see how we can help. I think that's probably how we ended up helping at the food pantry down the road. You know what I mean? Like, there were some individuals, we apparently love, one of the main outreaches, all the outreaches that we do almost always involve food. Like, we like feeding people. And so there are things that happen or things we find out or discover within our community that are needs or that are being met, but then they still need help. And so then you get the people who are passionate about the same thing together, and they can help make it happen. And so even though we're two different churches and two different denominations, we're able to come together and help meet a need in the community, because it's people who are passionate about that need.
Yeah.
And so, like, that's part of their purpose, is going and doing that very thing that they're passionate about, that they're, that helps them. Often it brings fulfillment, And so knowing that, like, oh, I made a difference today is a big deal. And I think it's also remembering that there's no small things. Like, I think sometimes people will get in their head of like, well, I'm just an accountant. So like, what's a big deal with that? Well, I mean, we have an accountant that works for us as a church. Like, but even in that, an accountant or somebody who does taxes, they're helping countless individuals be able to do something.
You might not take into account the people that you will bless through doing what God has given you the ability to do. And like you were saying, the graveyards are filled with people with visions. Think about if those visions aren't realized, how many people aren't blessed because those risks aren't taken.
Yes, absolutely. But yeah, I think that also, like, within Saul's story of this chapter,
I was wondering I know how David did it. I was wondering how Saul did it.
So we talked about those extremes, like the solutions that people will take. Well, we see Saul is really just trying everything he can. Like, he's placing blame on a lot of people, a lot of different things. So he's introduced in this chapter. He's kind of sitting around, he's sitting at the top of the hill in the royal city, like spear in hand, surrounded by royal officials, all this stuff. It looks like he has so much power. And so he's trying everything he can to hold on to that power. But it's the power that God has already said he's not going to keep.
Yep.
Right? And so now he's in this place where out of desperation, he is trying everything he can to hold on to that power. And so he's looking at human structures and human power things, like human political structures that have been put in place through being king and all these things. And what's crazy is he ends up in his blaming other people. Like, he starts blaming his officials because he hears about David returning to Judah. And he's like, none of you guys told me this. Like, he's just in my backyard and you didn't tell me this. Like, he's mad at them. And then, like, nobody wants to speak up and talk against him. Right. But then in the previous chapter, we were introduced to a few different people that come into play in this chapter. Doeg the Edomite was one of them. Doeg steps forward. And if you read through the previous chapter, Doeg he's an Edomite, which means he is someone who has no allegiance to Israel, to these kings, to David. Like, he really doesn't. Like, he is someone that comes from a people who would fight against the Israelites over and over again through Scripture, okay? So that's like a big red flag. But he was there whenever David had gone to visit Ahimelech the priest. So he saw what went down, and he comes forward and shares this with Saul. So Doeg is another one. He's doing this not because he cares about Saul. He's doing this because he sees this as a play for power.
Yep.
As a play to, like, increase his standing and his purpose, or, that kind of thing. And so Saul hears about this, and he's very careful in the way he says it. He doesn't end up saying that, like, David did anything wrong or David was actually planning anything against him. He just says, hey, I was there and Ahimelech helped him out. And so they call Ahimelech and his whole family forward, and he asks the priest, like, hey, did you do this? And the priest admits, but he's like, I knew nothing about any plans against you. Like, please don't punish me for this. Mm-hmm. And Saul does. Like, and in that, it's like an atrocious, terrible act, because he ends up having his whole family, kids, cattle, sheep, everything gets slaughtered. But none of the royal officials would do it. Doeg does it. Yeah. Okay? Doeg is only in it for himself. And Saul, who's only in it for himself, makes this crazy call. And I think for David, for Abiathar, however you say his name, one of the sons of Ahimelech escapes and goes to David during this time. And even for him, it's like seeing that and knowing what happened and what's going on can often feel like there's no way God can be moving in this. Yeah. Like, there's no way this could happen. Like, how is God actually accomplishing his purpose in this? And what you find when you study further is that Saul really kind of, even though it's terrible, acted within cultural, contextual rights of having the priest killed. Because typically priests would swear an oath to a king, and they would only, seek God or whatever deity they worshipped for that king alone. And so he ends up admitting that he did seek God's, guidance for David. So, yes, Saul could be in rights to kill him. But this is Saul's solution to something that isn't going to really help him in the long run, okay? However, Ahimelech comes from the line of Eli, which we were introduced to at the beginning of the book. Eli had wicked sons, and because Eli did not correct them, did not try to, do anything about it, there was a prophecy towards him and his family that God was going to wipe out his whole line of his family.
Yeah. That
there would be nobody who would remain priests in his line, in his lineage, okay? So this here, as bad as it was, is actually a way that God is fulfilling a prophecy that we saw back in chapter 2.
That's wild.
Right?
That is wild.
And so, but you wouldn't know that just reading through it.
Yeah.
Like you wouldn't make the connection about all those things that he comes from that line. And so even though Abiathar escapes, like you end up having like king-elect David and priest-elect, the only surviving priest, Abiathar, end up joining forces. Like, so even though this is terrible, they end up coming together. David ends up taking responsibility. They start up a relationship, and now he has a priest in his service that goes on to serve him throughout a good chunk of this book.
Yeah.
So it's like a double-fold thing of how God is moving and setting things up, but it's hard to see in that difficulty, like in a dark, terrible situation and thing. It's often hard for us to see it, but sometimes we can look back and see that it's actually a continuation of something, or you can look forward and know that that's going to actually help in some way. You just maybe don't know yet how much is going to help.
Yes.
But so like within that, knowing all those things, when I was studying it this past week, I was like, what? Like my mind was blown because I was like, I have read through this multiple times. I mean, I did this with my Bible study a couple years ago. I read through it while I was on sabbatical several years ago, and I did not know that connection. And so within this, God is showing that he is faithful to his word. And so he's saying he's faithful to his word. He's showing that through this, even as terrible as it is. So then David can see that even as terrible as his situation is, God is faithful to his word.
Yeah.
And God has anointed him for a purpose. So he can stick to that and keep looking back to that moment of God anointed me for a purpose. I don't know exactly what it is and when it's going to happen or how, but I know it is because God's faithful to his word. And his word over me was this. And Saul is really setting up his own demise within all of this too, because it's showing God is faithful to his word, and his word to Saul was, you will not remain as king. And now you're doing things that's turning even more people against you. And so, even in terrible things, like sometimes it's hard for us to see. I would say it's hard to feel, it's hard to understand or comprehend how, but realizing that even then, God is still moving and working. You just maybe won't always see it immediately.
That's good stuff. That's great stuff. I'm glad you said your mind was being blown, because I'm sitting here going,
I know.
That's good stuff. So if you want to like and subscribe, we are on all platforms that you listen to podcasts on, and we will be back here next week with another extra point in our Rise and Fall sermon series. Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in to The Extra Point. Be sure to subscribe to the Southridge Church podcast and tune in every Wednesday for another episode of The Extra Point.